Okay, so the news about President Trump's big pardon today is not out yet. And before that news comes out, I want to make sure that I talk about what's happened over the last couple days in Belarus. I talked about Belarus once already. There was a election, not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before that, on who was to be the new president of Belarus. Surprise, surprise, the incumbent won with supposedly 80% of the vote. Now, obviously, people do not usually win 80% of the vote in presidential elections, particularly when they've been in power for 26 years. People tend to get fatigued with their politicians after 26 years. So I'm fairly confident that Lukashenko did not win 80%. So I think that the protesters or rioters, which I don't know which they are, there's probably a mix of both. They probably have a decent point there. However, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that I think necessarily that this Lukashenko guy has less than a majority of support. He might have a majority of the support of the population, but probably not the big supermajority that he claims. With that said, however, there's lots of calls from neighboring governments and Western governments for Lukashenko to resign, and he seemed pretty defiant so far, essentially saying that this is just another Western color revolution, which he's not wrong in saying. The thing is that with these color revolutions, which for those of you unfamiliar, that's a reference to the trend of how these revolutions in Eastern Europe will always be about people coming out wearing, like, say, the color orange. In the case of Ukraine in like 2003, 2004, that was called the Orange Revolution. And there have been other things like this. It's always associated with something. Like this time in Belarus, I don't know if they're still calling it this, but I heard they were calling it the slipper revolution. Everyone would come out wearing slippers, and that would be a sign that you don't support the government or something. And what this is a sign is this is a strategy that's used by CIA, NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is essentially sort of like, it's an NGO that is basically the CIA. They like to organize these sorts of protests and things in countries that are not aligned with the United States. So that's certainly true, you can say that, but that doesn't mean that there's not legitimate opposition to whatever government you're dealing with, in this case, Lukashenko's, because the only way that the NED can rile people up, other than just, I guess, paying them off, and paying people to say they don't like the government, is they have to tap into the existing opposition there. And so you can say at the same time, this is what's so confusing about reading the news about this, is people will go one way or the other. People will say, oh, look at this. This is just a grassroots uprising of people who have grievances against the government, and they want a new president, and they want Lukashenko to resign because he does bad things that they don't like. Yes, that's true, but that's not the whole story. There's also this side, to where you have the NED and the CIA and these other Western groups probably funding and organizing these people and making sure that, what they don't get are, say, concessions from the government, but rather a total overthrow and the replacement of Lukashenko with someone who is aligned with NATO and the European Union and the United States. Whatever the slant is of the news organization you're reading, let's say you're reading a pro-Russian news organization, they're just going to say this is total color revolution, all these people are fake protesters. And if you're reading a Western news agency, you know what they're going to say. It's exactly what you've seen everywhere. Peaceful protesters, blah, 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 the same things they say about Black Lives Matter. And this isn't an entirely new thing by any means. In the history of Belarus, there's been uprisings like this from time to time against Lukashenko. I remember, I think they had some kind of, it was some kind of sports championship there a couple years ago, and people tried to take the opportunity to protest and say, Lukashenko, evil dictator, you should resign. I can't remember what it was. It wasn't the World Cup, but I feel like it was some kind of ball game. But anyway, Lukashenko tends to fare pretty well when it comes to these things. He just sort of rides out the storm, and it passes eventually. He seems to have had a pretty decent enough grip on power, considering that he was a long, before Belarus left the Soviet Union, he was I believe, a pretty high-ranking communist in Belarus, so he was well familiar with everyone. He was able to preserve the state structure of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. So not a lot has really changed in Belarus, which is something that I said, last week or a few days ago when I first talked about this. It's something really remarkable and interesting. It's not necessarily a good thing about Belarus that that you go there, it still looks like the Soviet Union. They still have all of these state-run factories and things that churn out, whatever garbage products. But it's interesting that he's been able to preserve that whole infrastructure. And so what that shows is that, he's very well entrenched within the whole established order in Belarus. The whole government is very deeply entrenched. Lukashenko is essentially an institution there, just like the military or the state factories or things like that. So that is what, in my opinion, has given him this longevity. But this time it seems like that's starting to slip a bit to where the other parts, the other institutions of the Belarusian establishment seem to be turning against him somewhat, because he gave a big speech yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, but I saw the reports yesterday, where he tried to give this big, speech about about all the unrest in front of an audience that was workers from a state factory. So you would think this would be, his political base. I mean, these are government employees. These are people who work in factories that, really only exist because he's preserved communism, for lack of a better term. And so these are people who would not benefit from change in Belarusian society, I wouldn't think. If you get a pro-NATO type person in there, I would think the first thing they do is privatize all of these state-owned factories that are incredibly inefficient and probably cost a lot of money. Yet while Lukashenko was up there giving his speech on TV in front of an audience that should be quite sympathetic to him, they were booing him and shouting "leave" in whatever the word is in their language. And so Lukashenko actually had to sort of talk back to the crowd. He couldn't just go about his speech. And he essentially said, hey, you guys have seen my harsh side. You've seen me, do some bad things. I'm not a saint, which, I thought that was a pretty impressive concession from a guy like this. But maybe that's just a part of Eastern European political culture. They're a little more open about being tough. Here in America, a politician would never admit to being brutal. George W. Bush would never speak that way about the things he did in Iraq. Kamala Harris would never speak that way about the things that she did to truant mothers, or the mothers of truant children. So Lukashenko went on to say, hey, the only way you're getting a new election is if you kill me. And it's pretty remarkable that Lukashenko had to say that to an audience of workers in a state-owned factory. And now the opposition woman, who is the wife of this YouTuber guy who was arrested a couple months ago for some kind of financial crime. Could have been trumped up, might not have been, I don't know. But anyway, this woman, his wife, was the candidate for the opposition in the presidential election, or at least she was the main candidate, and she's calling for a military coup, saying the military should turn against her. She's calling for a general strike, saying, and the military coup thing I don't think is going to happen, because the military is a pretty entrenched part of the establishment, but the general strike thing actually seems to be working somewhat, because people at a lot of these state-run factories are not showing up for work, and Belarusian state television, okay, the propaganda arm of Lukashenko's government, they went on strike against him too. So it's not looking good for old Alex. And now he's even saying that he's going to have some kind of constitutional referendum, and that if he loses it, he will willingly resign. And so things seem to be moving very quickly against Lukashenko. Now, of course, the elephant in the room here would be Vladimir Putin. Many of you must be wondering now, well, why would Putin allow all this? Why would Putin allow his last ally to fall like this to NATO? Well, the answer is that I don't think Putin would. But the thing is that people don't understand, who don't understand nuance, is that if you read Western media, they'll probably just say Lukashenko, Russian puppet. He is, he just does whatever Putin says. He lives and dies at the pleasure of Putin. But that's not really true. Lukashenko has, he's had his ups and downs with Putin. And so Putin would not be, I'm sure, opposed to getting rid of Lukashenko. He would just rather replace Lukashenko with someone who is more pro-Russian rather than more pro-NATO. Lukashenko, as it is, kind of tries to play both sides a little bit. But, at the end of the day, he is still within Russia's orbit. But he does, he plays nice with the U.S. and the West. And so he's kind of in the bad position to where neither side really thinks of him as a great ally. The West, even though he's friendly with them, would still much rather have an overtly pro-NATO, pro-Western person in there who will do whatever they say. Maybe somebody who actually has CIA training. And Putin, of course, would much rather have an overtly and totally immovably pro-Russian person in Lukashenko's spot. So I think it actually is, there's a decent chance now that after this whole referendum, he may end up resigning, but he will not be replaced with a pro-NATO person. I think somebody else from within sort of that inner orbit with the inner party, so to speak, will step forward and will recognize Putin as his great patron and, continue on with the government as the way things are. Because I certainly don't think that the Russians would just allow the U.S. or these other Western countries to install a pro-American leader like that. Belarus is too important. Russia really doesn't have anything else left. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.